Greetings and welcome to Change the World. My name is Guy Dauncey, and this is the show where I'm all about solutions and positivity and vision as we face the huge issues we've got to deal with. My guest today is Christine Boyle. Christine's an elected Vancouver City Councillor, born and raised on unceded Coast Salish territory in Vancouver, BC. She's also a community organiser, a climate justice activist, and a United Church minister. And when you were running for Vancouver City Council, you had a campaign slide said, "Vote like it's an emergency." Tell us what that's all about, Christine.
Yes, absolutely. So I have been a climate activist and organizer for many years. That's part of what led to me running for elected office. And in the same month that I was elected, that this council and in fact all of our municipal leaders across BC were elected, was the same month that the IPCC came out with their most recent large climate report in October 2018, which made very clear to us that we have 10 years or less to dramatically shift our emissions. And it stood out to the line that I think about a lot from that report is that every action matters, every bit of warming matters, every year matters, every choice matters. And so that's on my mind. That's on my mind in every decision that I make in this role.
Yeah, I have a saying that I tell to myself and to other people, that if you think you've understood the climate emergency and you haven't yet had that awful sinking feeling in your belly, you haven't understood it yet, because when you really drill into the details, it's very concerning, very alarming, right?
Yeah, and I've been glad to see the increased recognition and use of the term emergency. I mean, I think, you know, and I'm sure many folks know, we've shifted from kind of climate change as a neutral term to really recognizing the crisis. What we haven't done in most places is shifted our response to make clear that we understand the scale of the emergency, and that's a big part of where my energy and focus is. You know, divided as it is at a local level amongst all the other interwoven issues that local governments are dealing with.
Yeah, so I want to focus on what's happening in Vancouver specifically. But before we get to that, in your role as a church minister, you did get the privilege of going to Rome. And did you meet the Pope with his Si Laudate? And can you explain? Just mention that for a minute. Go on.
Sure, absolutely. So I'll just take one step back and say, to speak to that sinking feeling, when I really jumped fully into climate work, and before that a lot more of my work of social justice work, I was doing a lot more work on poverty and inequality. When I got into climate work, I immediately felt that deep sinking pit in my stomach, which I haven't shaken yet. And at the time, the place where I found the most hope was in the fossil fuel divestment movement, in kind of breaking the stalemate that we seem to be at that point in climate. And so I got into doing divestment work like lots of young climate activists. And in my case, doing that within faith-based circles. And so I led the United Church nationally in divesting from fossil fuels. And then I was selected as a delegate from the United Church of Canada to be part of the civil society delegation at COP21 in Paris. And I got to go to Rome for events surrounding the release of Laudato Si. And in that case, actually, I was sort of partly there with a civil society hat on, and I was partly there because my sister-in-law, Naomi Klein, was invited to speak at the events, and I was kind of her support and resource person. But the Pope wasn't in audience at most of those events. Lots of cardinals, lots of the sort of
big robes and stuff. So for those who are listening who don't quite know, Laudate Si is, I believe, the papal encyclical that the Pope released, basically saying that nature matters. Really?
Yeah, and not just nature actually, but it was pretty strong in its connection between climate and inequality, and so it really set a new frame for the Catholic Church, but then you know, the Christian world more broadly, and beyond that, I think, to faith circles around the globe and conversations happening about creation care and climate and beyond.
Yeah, and when I introduced you, I forgot to say you're also a mother of 2 children. How does that play into all of your life?
I mean, it keeps me busy, is the sort of key thing. And it, of course, it's a factor in how much I care about these issues. Though I'm sort of cautious. I appreciate the folks who are doing organizing among parents on climate, and I think I would care just as much about these issues without my own children as chatty, sassy little reminders of the urgency of it, because I equally care about other people's children too. So I think it's sort of both useful as an organizing tool, I guess, and also not to reduce the work to we care because we have children, because I know so many climate activists who are as activated, and it isn't about their own generational line.
I've been activated on this file for 25 years and I don't have any children. But let's dig in. We're talking in the city of Vancouver, I believe, is showing really important leadership. And you set a goal to reduce the entire city's climate pollution by 50% by 2030, and then the rest of it by 2050. Talk to the importance of these goals and what it took to get Vancouver to agree to this. And then we'll go into the details of transportation and buildings.
Sure, absolutely. So first of all, I'd say I think the first important part of it was Vancouver was the first city in English-speaking Canada to recognize the scale of the crisis and naming it as an emergency. And so we were part of this movement of declaring a climate emergency. And in Canada, we were an early part of that and really got to lead. And it let me have a lot of follow-up conversations with locally elected leaders across the country who wanted to do similarly, who wanted to raise the expectation of and level of ambition in their plans in telling the truth about the crisis. So that was the first piece. And the other leadership piece connected to that in my original climate emergency motion was really making sure that equity and justice were woven into the plan from the beginning. So there's a criticism in a lot of urban climate work, and it's certainly the case in Vancouver, that climate work becomes sort of greening work that contributes to gentrification. It contributes to pushing out of low-income people from certain neighborhoods, and without sufficient protections and without a real equity lens right from the beginning. All of that happens and is a risk, and it needs to be addressed. So that was the other key piece of shifting the city's climate work in the motion that I brought forward, was this recognition of the emergency of real focus on where the emissions are. And we can get to what that looks like in Vancouver, and then a centering of equity and justice in how we approach it.
Yeah, I want to come to the equity and justice and the public engagement piece later. So anyone who's involved in actually tackling the crisis very soon starts talking percentages. And the reality is that Vancouver's climate pollution is 39% coming from transportation, 54% from buildings, and then just 2% electricity and 4% waste. So it's really transportation and buildings are the key things that matter, right? And diet. I mean, diet is stuff in our personal control, but it's tough for the city to tell people you should eat less meat. But we have to influence ourselves in that direction. But it's transportation and buildings we're really talking about today, I think.
Yeah, and it was important for us in the plan that we lay out an action plan of the key pieces that are in our jurisdiction, particularly because so much of it is in our jurisdiction. And there was and continues to be, I think, a public education piece to help people understand that because so much of the climate solutions that we've been told are personal lifestyle stuff. I think a lot of folks have a distorted sense. If they were to guess the percentages of emissions from different things, it wouldn't reflect what the numbers actually tell us. And so something like recycling, we're told, is an important climate solution, and absolutely it's an important solution on a lot of fronts. But where the city really needs to focus, if we're taking the emergency on greenhouse gas emissions seriously, is on transportation and buildings. And so that was a key part. And they're not the lowest hanging fruit. Like, we've done the lowest hanging fruit, and we have some hard work ahead of us.
Yeah. So on transportation, you've set the goal that by 2030, which is just 9 years away, 90% of all trips to work will be an easy walk or a roll, meaning bicycle, skating, or something like that, right? Including electric bikes. And then you want 2/3 of all trips to be done by active transportation, walking or cycling or rugging, or by transit. And for the remaining vehicle trips, half of those trips are with electric vehicle or some other zero emission vehicle. Is that right?
Yeah, so in part that's reflecting a pretty clear understanding that we can't actually just shift our existing transportation network, which largely relies on private vehicles. We can't just switch all of those private vehicles from gas to electric and kind of be done. We actually need a much more significant transformation of our transportation system, both in terms of how road space is used and shared, so that we're creating more space and safer space for active transportation, so that we're prioritizing public transportation in a way that makes it faster and more efficient, so it's a better option for most people. And then built into that is the reality that a key part of urban climate work is housing and land use. And so if we want to avoid increased urban sprawl, longer commutes, the destruction of farmland and wild spaces, we need to create more housing for people close to jobs and in the city. And then we're going to have more people needing to get around in the city, which especially means we can't have them all just in their own electric cars. We need more efficient use. And so all of that is part of how the transportation system shifts. That isn't just a reliance on the kind of fun tech tools like EVs.
So when I wrote my novel Journey to the Future, which is set in Vancouver in the year 2032 as a sort of a vision of what it could be, I had cycling of every kind and every shape and size everywhere, with bike trails everywhere, electric bikes, electric tricycles for the older people. Is that in Victoria, when the city brought in the bike lanes, they met resistance from motorists who sort of resented this. But the motorists didn't seem to understand that every cyclist is not driving a car. It's actually making it easier for the other motorists.
Yeah, well, and having cyclists have safe and separated lanes is safer for car drivers too, because you don't have to worry so much about collisions. So absolutely, I'm a cyclist. I think we need to continue our build out of cycling infrastructure. And I would say that the other key piece for me is a bigger build out of public transportation networks, not just in the big investment pieces like SkyTrains and subways, though I would like to see more of that. But one of the key things that the city can do is create bus-only lanes. So I am like very nerdy about bus-only lanes all of a sudden, because if we can make the buses travel twice as fast because they're not stuck in traffic, then for a transit user, it feels like twice as many buses are on the road, and they're getting places faster. So that too it's a bit of a tension with cars, because it makes for less private vehicle space, but it gets everyone to their location faster.
Well, certainly we've been doing that in Victoria.
Yeah.
And also, I'm assuming that given how many electric buses China has, like 100,000, all buses can be electric and can manage the journey quite happily under electric power, right?
Yeah, that's a TransLink jurisdiction, but absolutely the direction that they're heading in as well.
And for those who are changing to an electric vehicle, even if they're not using it to get to work, they're still going to probably have a car. The complications around recharging the cars on crowded streets and apartment blocks and condominiums, it's a convoluted bundle of difficulties, but it's got to be solved, right?
Yeah, so that is also part of the plan, and we're looking at public charging stations, and in particular mapping out where charging exists and how we can serve underserved neighborhoods, how we can get charging stations into existing rental buildings without it being part of an upgrade of a building that demovicts or displaces people. So there's continues to be all of these tensions that exist.
And some of the technical breakthroughs around battery are just phenomenal. Cars having There's normal electric car has a 400-kilometer range now, but we're talking future ones with a 1,000-kilometer range. Just phenomenal, right?
Yeah.
But let's move off transport and get onto buildings, because that is 54% of your emissions.
Yeah.
And I presume we've got to talk about the new buildings and how do we retrofit all our existing buildings. So let's deal with the easier bit first, which is the new buildings. How do you plan to eliminate the use of oil and gas for heating in buildings?
So actually, prior to this full report coming forward, Council already had approved a plan to shift new buildings off of natural gas. And that went through last spring, kind of early in the pandemic, which was an interesting early pandemic test of still being able to move forward on climate while we were facing this other concurrent challenge. And I was pleased to see that not get stalled out.
Yeah.
So Vancouver already had passed a series of pretty strict limits on natural gas use for heating and hot water in new buildings. And interestingly, it was not just multifamily buildings, but also new low density single family and duplex buildings, which has been sort of the sacred cow that we don't touch on a lot of levels.
So tell me the nitty gritty. What does pretty strict mean?
So I would have to dig up the numbers. I will say,
is the use of gas eliminated after a certain year?
So the approach that staff took, and this was a debate that I know a lot of people were having. The approach that we ended up taking wasn't based on fuel type, it was based on emission numbers. Right. And so my understanding of the approach, I was happy to say, let's just say no new natural gas hookups as of 2021 or 2023 or whatever the date is. Let's just say we don't go there anymore. There was unsurprisingly a fair amount of pushback from Fortis around their renewable work, et cetera. And so the place that the city of Vancouver landed was on emissions caps for new buildings that make it, my understanding is they make it very hard to have gas use, but they don't restrict it based on.
Okay. The paradox of this is that the city of Brussels, the capital of Belgium, they passed a rule in 2015 that every single building had to be passive house standard from then onwards, large, small, schools, hospitals, whatever. And a passive house needs no additional heat whatsoever. And they've had no complaints, and their carbon footprint for buildings has just, fallen off a cliff because every new building uses, and it's cheaper to run. And the only cost, sort of 4 or 5% more to build, but you've got no heating costs.
Yeah, so I think that's the direction we're going in. I will also say one of the concerns that we heard in this building piece, both on new buildings and existing buildings, was capacity within the trades and within the sector to go this route. So the city of Vancouver has been a partner in training and building up that capacity, and that continues to need to happen. We certainly faced this in my household when we were looking at switching, when we did switch from natural gas heating and hot water to a heat pump and an electric hot water heater. And we had a hard time finding a local service who understood why we were making that change. We did eventually.
We did the change ourselves. We switched from a natural gas to a heat pump, and the heat pump just works just dandy, just keeps us warm and toasty. It's just fine, right? In Brussels, they gave the carpenters 4 years to prepare. They passed the votes in 2011. They said by 2015, all buildings have to be passive house standards. So they had the same problem of needing to train the trades.
Yeah, well, and I think that model of shifting from incentives to end dates is part of how we communicate and recognize the emergency. And I want to see us go there in as many ways as possible. So even the model that we took, which is being built off of the New York City model, which is around limiting emissions, and then on the existing building retrofit side, scaling down those emissions caps over time to require changes as systems need to be replaced, is equally a good model, because it's still not just carrots, it's sticks, and that's where we need to go.
So the more difficult challenge for building is how do we retrofit all our existing buildings, 90% of which will still be standing in 2030 or 2050. What's the city's approach to persuading and helping and encouraging people to do that?
Yeah, so again, it's based on New York City's goal, and it's looking at an emission cap. So first, we need to start measuring much more broadly than we're doing. We can't reduce what we're not measuring, and then we're setting emissions maximums that scale down over time. So with a model that basically, if you're living in an older home and you have a natural gas heating and hot water system, we're not going to say next year you need to just kill the system and replace it. What the model requires is that when that system conks out and would need to be replaced anyway, at that point you'll need to replace it with an electric system. So we're not forcing that shift ahead of and wasting existing systems, but we are rolling out that change so that if each new furnace lasts maybe 15 years, and we're making clear now when that furnace goes down it needs to be replaced, that gets us to sort of around 2035 in terms of all of those systems having been replaced at their end of life anyway.
Yeah, it's one of my frustrations that I see that the building associations giving great awards for sustainable buildings, and they're all burning natural gas. They're bringing up new buildings with a good lifetime, and they're just making the problem worse. It's like pouring gas onto the climate fire, and it just frustrates me personally when I know that heat pumps and good passive house standards do a really good job. Yeah. Absolutely. And so also you have to deal with persuading landlords and condominium councils about them having to make the change.
Yeah, so interestingly, one of the things I heard from commercial building owners is that they are already making these changes because the return on investment is so clear for them.
Yeah.
But it's sort of single family and detached homeowners which still makes up a huge portion of residential space in Vancouver, and a lot of those buildings are old and leaky. Those are harder to change, and so that was part of the plan. And then I'll just say the current plan that Vancouver just passed kind of put a pause on how this would be enforced for existing rental buildings, because there's a lot of caution, as I alluded to earlier, about the impacts in terms of displacement of existing renters. And so staff were very clear that we need to figure out how we ensure security of tenure for existing renters before we place these enormous expectations on those buildings. So that piece is kind of what I'll just say is still in the works as we figure out the balance between those things.
Yeah, so let's move straight on to the piece about equity, because a lot of people say, well, I just can't afford a heat pump, I can't afford this, and I have to pay the rent to the landlord. How do we ensure equity, which means social justice and concern for all people, whatever their incomes, as we do this hugely important transition?
Yeah, I mean, the plan proposed it in a number of ways with a kind of overarching frame that we need to ensure that those who can afford to pay are paying, and that those who can't afford it aren't carrying more burden. And so one of the key examples that I like to give people when I talk about how we need to use equity as a frame in climate work is looking at the amount of resources that we're putting into building up infrastructure for electric vehicle charging relative to the amount of resources that we're putting into strengthening our public transit system, because transit is the equitable solution. EVs are a portion, and we need to keep having that conversation, but transit should be where we're focusing, along with active transportation. Similarly, on housing, there was a real this was the balance between detached housing homeowners and existing affordable rental stock. We need to be expecting more of someone who owns a detached home in Vancouver, which in Vancouver means you have some wealth, even if it's not cash in the bank. There's equity, significant equity there. If you own a detached home, you may not feel rich, but that exists. So we can expect those folks to be able to afford to make
Yeah.
those changes.
So I know that we're talking about the climate issues, but I know that Vancouver also has the whole Greenest city plan with all sorts of stuff around growing more food and reducing waste and planting trees and making the. Do you feel the city's on track to be the greenest city in the world by some date soon?
I mean, being the greenest city in the world.
I mean, every city should be the greenest,
Yeah,
shouldn't it?
it wasn't my end goal. So, like,
Yeah.
if we get there, great. But I hope there's lots of competition and everybody's trying to get there. And I don't care if we win. I've always been terrible at that sort of competition. I would say the Greenest City Action Plan laid a lot of valuable framework. We have some incredible staff throughout the city of Vancouver. The shift to the Climate Emergency Action Plan has been a really focused look at where the emissions are coming from, which was actually the portion of the Greenest City Action Plan where we weren't meeting our targets even a little bit.
I just wanted to emphasize to our viewers that Vancouver is also doing a lot to help people grow more local food and stuff like that. But in our last couple of minutes, talk about the public response. I know you've done some surveying and polling about how the public's responding to these policies. What's it look like?
Yeah, so city staff did a number of polls, particularly on some of the game-changing moves within this plan. And, you know, in Vancouver, there is support for climate action. And I think people understand that the changes that are required aren't going to be little and easy, that there are some big changes coming. And for the most part, they're on board with it. They want to make sure that it's equitable. They want to be included in figuring out how these things get implemented. All of those pieces, which really are true of all of our climate work. But absolutely, there is support for continuing to move this forward in a thoughtful and engaged and ambitious way.
So from your perspective as a councillor, what's your advice to other people who want to move their Duncans and their Ladysmiths and their Port Hardys and their Victorias along the same path? What's your advice to people?
I mean, I think the first place to start is to tell the truth, is to name the scale of the crisis and set your goals at the scale of the crisis, and then refuse to waver from that. And then that's the frame. The frame is we have to do what the science tells us is required, and we have to do it in a way that centers justice. And if there's no budging from that, then it shifts the whole window. That's the new conversation, and that's what we plan for.
And my perspective from around the world is that when we do these solutions, you're getting cheaper transport, you're getting cheaper residential, you've got cleaner air, you're eliminating air pollution, you've got a more beautiful place to live. What's not to like about all this, right?
Yeah, exactly. The co-benefits. I mean, there's so much that we benefit from when we get there, and we just need to make sure we're going there together. We're not leaving those most impacted behind.
So our time is up, Christine. This has been fantastic. For more information on you, it's christineboyle.ca, and with the city, it's vancouver.ca, right?
Yes.
So I want to thank you for the personal efforts you put in, all the work, the meetings, the phone calls, to make this thing real as a dedication in your life, not just now, but all the previous years as well. So thank you on behalf of all our viewers for that.
Thanks for having this conversation. I'm always part of it.
And to our viewers in general, you've been watching Change the World. My name's Guy Dauncey, and tune in next week for another slice of positive visionary thinking. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.